The Cold War heats up, a presentation on theories, tactics, and conflicts during the Cold War. As we know, following World War II, U.S. and Russia began their animosity towards each other. What America feared was the spread of communism. This fear caused the United States to develop the concept of the domino theory, which was that if one nation in a region went communist, others would follow. Another approach the United States established was the concept of containment. And what containment meant that the United States would resist the spread of communism and prevent the domino theory. The first tactic the United States would use to prevent the spread of communism became known as the Truman Doctrine. And this was established in 1947, and President Truman, who it was named after, declared that the U.S. would provide military aid to Greece in order to prevent it from going communist. The second tactic the United States used was called the Marshall Plan, and it was issued in 1947. The Marshall Plan was an economic aid to the war-torn nations of Western Europe. This was an attempt to stop the spread of communism by building prosperous, strong European countries. In the year 1950, the Cold War saw its first conflict. This conflict was in Korea. In 1950, the communist North invaded the South. The U.S. and its allies came to the aid of the South and prevented a communist takeover. Korea is still divided today, North and South at the 38th parallel. The second conflict in the Cold War started in 1946, and it was the original Vietnam War, the original Vietnam conflict. And this conflict was between the Viet Cong, and they were communist forces of the North, and they defeated the French, and they were helping out the South, Vietnamese. Once the United States saw that the French had been defeated by the communist North, they decided to get involved and prevent the Viet Cong from turning into a communist nation. In 1964, the United States became directly involved in the conflict and lasted until 1973. During those 9 years, there was a loss of 60,000 soldiers, and in 1973, the United States withdrew. The Vietnamese conflict lasted for 2 more years following United States withdrawal, and ultimately the North would successfully defeat the South. And today, Vietnam remains communist. A proxy war is a war instigated by major powers that does not itself become involved. The Korean War and the Vietnam War are great examples of proxy wars. Does anybody know what an example of a proxy war is that's occurring today? As we've been learning about and watching in 13 days, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest call of the Cold War. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the USSR, put missiles in communist Cuba. When United States found out, they were in panic. What do we do? How do we solve this crisis? Ultimately, the U.S., led by John Kennedy, was able to negotiate a deal and prevent any nuclear attacks. By the 1980s, nearing the end of the Cold War, the United States economy began outperforming the Soviet economy. The USSR felt it had to reform its economy in order to compete in the World War. Ultimately, these reforms would lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.